Welcome back to Meet at the Well. I'm Mariana, and this podcast is a place for people living in the hard middle, too sacred for the secular, too secular for the sacred. Here we practice slow conversations rooted in dignity across difference, truth told tenderly, curiosity instead of control, and hope rooted in Christ. Today's conversation sits right at the intersection of faith, culture, and one of the most difficult words shaping our common life, truth. Many people today feel like we're living in entirely different realities. Families are divided, churches are fractured, communities are struggling to agree on what is even real. My guest today is Dr. Jared Stacy, historian and theologian, and the author of the new book, Reality in Ruins: How Conspiracy Theory Became an American Evangelical Crisis. The book releases March 17th and is already the #1 new release in religion and sociology, which tells you something about how urgently people are trying to understand this moment. In Reality in Ruins, Jared explores how conspiracy thinking is not simply a collection of wrong facts, but a powerful storytelling ecosystem, one that shapes entire worlds, identities, and communities. What makes this book especially compelling is that Jared writes not as a distant observer, but as someone who's deeply familiar with evangelical culture and its imagination. And at the heart of this conversation is a deeper question. What does it mean to tell the truth again? And perhaps even more importantly, how do we return to shared realities in a way that actually reflects the way of Jesus? So Jared, welcome to Meet at the Well.
Mariana, thank you for having me. That was a phenomenal introduction. You've really captured, I think, the heart of the book, the spirit of the book, and the time that we're living in. So it was good for me to sort of being on the receiving end of that and listen to that. Thank you.
I'm so glad. Honestly, that was one of my top priorities because when I read your book, I was very excited and I was trying to pace myself because there's so many threads and so much that you have to offer in this book. And I wanted to make sure that we knew what was at the heart of it. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about yourself. If you could tell us who's Jared Stacy and give us some
Yeah.
behind the scenes.
I'm sitting in a house in St. Petersburg, Florida, where incidentally this is where I grew up. Not in this particular house, but just 3 minutes down the road. And so I've been on a journey. You know, I grew up here in the Tampa Bay area in St. Pete, Florida. I went to a fundamentalist Baptist church as a child and went to a non-denominational Christian school from preschool all the way up to graduation. From there, I attended Jerry Falwell's Liberty University and went to a Southern Baptist seminary where I became a pastor in New Orleans and got my master's there, and then went to pastor college students in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And then from there, I kind of underwent a perpetual crisis of faith that had been stewing for a very long time. Going back to my time in New Orleans and probably elements of it throughout my whole life. And I think I kind of picked that up in the book a little bit. And so then I went from there, left pastoral ministry and went and pursued theological education and got a PhD in Scotland, in Aberdeen.
Awesome.
That was another cross-cultural experience, which was good and healthy. And now I've come back, full circle to my hometown and to many of the same kind of adjacent places where I grew up and was formative for me. You know, I've said it before, and it's come out. You know, as the more I talk about the book, is I was very much my biography alone would suggest. I am very much a son of the evangelical house in America. I mean, I'm very familiar with it to the point I'm almost, in some ways, I could still be comfortable in it. But there are and have been these key points now of contradiction that in the book, sort of things that I don't feel like can be made peace with. And those are ideas, right? These are systems. It's not necessarily people. And
Ideologies.
the extent that people are caught up in these things is where I also offer my personal story, right? And I've thought a lot about the story of Gideon. So for some of your listeners, and I love how you say it, the hard middle, I think is how you described it.
Yes.
So the name of my Substack, incidentally, is No Man's Land, and that term taken from World War I, right? That contested piece of ground is where I feel like I'm in some ways part of responding to God's call is inhabiting this sort of contested land and not finding home in trenches, and to be able to think about the story of Gideon has been super formative for me, and thinking about coming full circle. That the story we tell of Gideon in white churches in America, particularly Anglo-Saxon churches in America, tends to focus on Gideon as liberator. They don't often focus on Gideon as a sort of prophet. And before he ever was tasked with recruiting an army, God told him to tear down the idol that was in his hometown, and incidentally enough, in his father's backyard. And Gideon was so scared to do that he did it at night. I've been thinking about that and the call that I've felt like has been God's call just of faith in my life, and finding a lot of resonance with that story. Not that I'm positioning myself as Gideon, but mainly the way that when God calls a community to himself, he also removes the idols that we may ascribe victory to. And
Oof, so good.
so I think that story sort of frames, what the book is trying to do. That it's not necessarily holding evangelicals as a particularly paranoid sort of people, or in some ways worse than everybody else. Conspiracy theory is a particular modern problem, and we can get into that more. But I'm telling a story that is set in a particular group of people in a particular place. And my experience with conspiracy theory is not an academic exercise. This was something that had to do with my own reconversion. If
Wow.
if I could frame it that way, I feel like I've become Christian all over again in the process of this, and so that's why. And I'll just kind of land this so we can kind of continue the conversation. Is I increasingly identify as post-evangelical, and that's my way of sort of answering two main questions. And the first being, well, what do we do to repair evangelicalism in America? And I'm saying that that's the wrong question. I'm not interested in repairing a movement. I'm not interested in rebranding. I'm not interested in recapturing a label. That label has always been contested, evangelical, and I'm not interested in that project at all. But on the other hand, I can't exhume nor what's the word? I can't deny my past. I can't deny where
Right.
I've come from. I won't do
Right.
that.
Right.
And so it has become a part of the theology that I'm doing, is to
Yes.
acknowledge that when I'm talking about evangelicalism, I'm not just talking about a material, cultural, network of institutions. I'm also talking about a we. Talking about a group of people that, in some ways, I'm still going to define myself within that community because of my past. And so my pastor here in Tampa has a really good way of looking at this. He goes, if we just give up the evangelical label, no one has to say they're sorry. And
Oof.
so
That is so good.
that is my reason for retaining association with the label without claiming it as a sort of repair project. I'm not interested in that. But at the same time, I'm still a practicing Christian. So I'm also realizing that the ex-evangelical label, which I've used that before, I hold these things incredibly loosely, and just recognizing that everyone has different experiences, and the reasons that we choose or opt for certain labels to describe our journey is really specific. And I'm just not really interested in very broad strokes. So even, when I talk about evangelicals in the book, I make a claim, there's no authorized story of this group of people in America.
I love
And
that you said
and
that
so
word.
I say all that to say,
Yep.
whoever's listening to this, however you're feeling about our moment, there are particular problems that have been forced upon the common life of the United States of America by a group of people who do identify in some way, shape, or form with the evangelical label. I'm not denying that fact at all.
Right.
However, I am calling us to an encounter with various people
Yes.
that pushes past caricature into concrete realities. And so we can dive into that more, but I think I'm
Yeah.
hopeful that people find in me, in my story, as I'm kind of describing it here, just a willingness to acknowledge the complexity of our moment, and not in a way to sort of deny or dismiss things, as is often the case, but really an opportunity to sit with complexity and nuance in a way that I think can actually prove really generative for asking the questions, where do we go from here?
Where do we
Not just
go?
how did we get here, those are the two kind of questions that I really pick up in the book.
I I mean, my gosh, Jared, I'm right now, just as I'm taking in everything you've said, I think that such encounter is happening even now in this conversation. And the reason I say that is I have walked a similar path as you, but in a different culture and label, but not, and I'm not using that loosely, as you said. I'm using it as more of data and information to name it where I'm at, right? So I always have this visual. I'm a creative, so I have this visual of knocking on a cathedral, gorgeous stained glass window, and I'm trying to come in, and I just don't fit in. And so the evangelical spaces, even though faith was always a big part of my life, it was always by proxy. The church hurt I got was in my home. It was my father taking in, and by second hand, kind of dictating what it was. And so I never really was part of that in that way, but feel just as similar to you as learning what follower of Christ am I? What do I stand for? And I'm not interested, as you said, in fixing any systems that have been created, because I don't feel that Jesus has called us to do that. I think he's called us to restore dignity in these spaces and restore. And so I love how our conversations kind of headed towards that. And I just love that you mentioned encounter, because I think these are the conversations we are to have in order to do so.
Yeah.
And so, yes, go ahead,
Well,
Jared.
I was just gonna say, and
Yeah.
I think oftentimes, when we talk about, not wanting to repair, not wanting to fix, it's because there's a more radical sort of change at hand,
Hmm.
and I think the whole project of sort of making evangelicalism palatable again, or popular, or some sort of like exercising for whatever brand reputation it may or may
Hmm.
not have. And I'm using that language particularly and specifically. I think a lot of times what we're talking about is that these sorts of encounters are actually prove more ruinous to the material systems that have been constructed and the institutions than we might
Hmm.
otherwise expect. To really respond to witness in this way. And I've said this to pastors. Like I realize that some of the implications of what my work is suggesting could get you fired
Hmm.
from your job.
Right.
Or would mean the dissolution of the way that we think about and construct churches in America. And so in some ways we're taking a very long trajectory here to say, like, are we willing to, and this way it's a play on the words reality and ruins, is that it's descriptive, but it's also
Hmm.
prescriptive, in that
Right.
the ruining of our reality in the revelation of Jesus, and that's a very Christian claim,
Right.
is actually a good thing, and it's more subversive, it's more radical, and I suppose
Absolutely.
I suppose in that way, when I start talking like this, I do sound very evangelical, but evangelical not in a set of cultural, political, partisan. I
Hmm.
should use that word instead of political.
Hmm.
Partisan, shibboleths, but really focusing on, what does it mean to hear the living word, and to
It's
listen.
funny you say the living word, and my brain was saying language. It's
Yeah,
a
exactly.
hijacked language.
Yeah.
And as you were saying that, it just came to me, it was like storytelling and myth. And I think one of the things that you bring up in your book, Jared, is this term disreality. And you describe the cultural moment that we're living in. And would you mind sharing a little more of what disreality means?
Sure. I mean, there are really two concepts, and these are hopefully very lived. Like people, it's just putting language to think things that we already feel. And by disreality, I simply mean that there's not just false facts floating around in the air anymore. There's an entire destabilizing, existentially destabilizing vibe, that we don't know what's real, and we're able to see a glimmer that there are several realities on offer, even.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
there are several pathways that we could go down to sort of create, and this is the second concept, create a sense of totality.
Right.
Right. So the experience of reality is a sort of a bounded whole. I mean, that's what conspiracy theory offers.
Hmm.
Um, but it's this predictable state. And
Hmm.
so I kind of view disreality and totality as sort of these an existential state that leads us to want totality. And in some ways, buried in that in the book is a sort of offering a criticism to what has often been shared about people who identify as conspiracy theorists, is that, that that they don't live in reality. And there's two problems with that language. Number one, I mean, I work in healthcare, so
Right.
I'm sitting here saying we have to be very careful in pathologizing and making attaching clinical language to people who are not portraying any sort of symptomatic disease here.
Exactly.
And so that could be very fundamentally altering and distorting language in and of itself. It's like, oh, you don't live in reality. I
Right.
understand why people say it,
Right.
but I'm offering a sort of criticism of like, hey,
What you're actually saying.
yeah,
Yeah.
we can't be dismissive in that way, because there are clinical conditions where paranoid visions are a feature of those conditions. And that there's a whole nother, I mean, I could point to theologians who are doing incredible work, Cody Bivens
Yeah.
Starr, John
Yeah.
Swinton, like there's Lisa Arnold Power. There's so many who are going down that trap. But the second thing that I would say is that when we start talking about, well, they don't live in reality, offering this criticism of saying, hey, reality is what we really mean is totality. Like these people over here, they don't fit within what we experience as our group, this in group experiences as a set of reflexive, automatic cultural assumptions that are based in quote unquote, fact. So
Hmm.
underneath all of that is really resurfacing this debate over, the compatibility of science and faith, the limits of fact, and the possibility of storytelling. And I'm laying all this out on the table for readers who say, well, okay, this is a lot. Well, this is why I enjoy doing podcasts,
Right.
because I'm a writer, I'm an author, and there's so much that went into each word, each sentence on the page, and there was so much behind the scenes, right?
Right.
Of like, here's where these debates are kind of setting up and framing what the book's actually claiming.
Right.
And
Here's more
so
context.
exactly. So
Absolutely.
when
Right.
we talk about disreality, it's sort of this acknowledgement that, the old stories aren't working anymore. The old accounts of the world aren't functioning the way that they ought.
Oh
And
my
that does
gosh.
lead people
Yeah.
to anxiety. It leads people to try and cope. And what are we coping for? What are we looking for? Well, we're looking for this experience of reality as a bounded whole, of totality.
Right.
And so what I'm really gesturing towards in the book then is saying, totality is very dangerous though.
Absolutely.
And so I'm trying to allow us to regain our cutting edge, of acknowledging that we don't know a lot, and bringing uncertainty back into the equation. And I think that the Christian faith offers us a very unique, unstable ground,
Hmm.
to be able to approach the world and say, we are a people who don't know.
Right.
um,
Oh my gosh, that
and
is so good. Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
that's sort of, and it based on what we are confessing, right? So
Right.
there's a whole difference in sort of entering the political sphere and saying like, I'm possessing the knowledge of good and evil, versus confessing a God who alone draws that line. And
Oh, and I have to. Oh my gosh, I was just writing an essay, Jared, on this, and for Substack, and I can't believe you hit that. It's actually reminds me of Genesis,
yes,
what we were protected from. So
exactly.
I get goosebumps. Like it's
Yes.
what we're protected from. And so we're actually trying to find it's the temptation all over again, which is conspiracy theories claim secret knowledge, right? And it's like it separates insiders from outsiders, it creates division, and yet the gospel, which is the good news, and good news that is not embodied by the hurting is not good news at all, right? So it shows us a different path, and that path is truth revealed through encounter. And that is right. So, I mean,
And
so good.
that sort of encounter. I mean, it's distinctly comes to us the way God reveals Himself in the Hebrew Scriptures, and then in the New Testament as Christian Scripture as well. And we look at this, and it's such a stark contrast between the Christianity in ascendancy and on offer in the United States government,
Right.
and the MAGA movement, and
Right.
other Christianities, and the distinction here, and conspiracy theory gets baked into this because the
Hmm.
sort of certainty that this Christianity claims. I mean, it's very much an inversion of Jesus's statement, that the Gentiles lord it over themselves, but it will not be so among you, right? As He's talking to His disciples, like this isn't
Right.
how this works. And so whenever the church tries to manage history by either accomplishing it or accelerating it, all those theologies are on offer right now in our present war in Iran.
Right.
The posture that the book is sort of opening up for us is a refusal to manage history, a
Oh,
refusal to
yes.
view politics in a ways that presumes that we can dominate, coerce, and where does that confidence though in that sort of uncertainty come from? Well, it comes from the biblical claim that reality is actually Jesus, and we are recipients
Right.
of that.
Right.
That is grace.
Right.
And so it is a very Christian claim. I mean, my cash
Mm-hmm.
out in the book is distinctly Christian,
Mm-hmm.
but I also gesture towards like people who aren't and saying like, look, like you may have come out of these spaces trying to maintain your integrity. I want to be able to offer a way to say Christian faith can still be viable and helpful for our common life
Right.
that includes non-Christians, because it asks a different set of questions that could
Yes.
benefit. So it's not coercive in the sense that I think you need to be Christian in order to benefit from, this sort of uncertainty. No, but I think the origins of this uncertainty
Can
has
benefit
Christian claims.
societies.
But
Yeah.
I think it benefits people who aren't, and
Right.
we could all benefit from a Christianity in our public life and in our churches that is more keen on listening than it
Agreed.
is on claiming for itself.
Agreed. I when I was walking through my path of finding out what do I believe truly, I ended up as a 40-year-old back in my undergrad finishing my bachelor's in English literature.
Awesome.
And then finding someone, a professor, who took me under his wing and became a mentor and showed me marginalized voices and showed me that his classroom had been his pulpit for 35 years, and never recognized, right, by an official church. But he showed me that the gospel is for the marginalized, is for the margins, right? And so, as you were speaking, Jared, and talking about storytelling, and at the end of the day, I think you're absolutely right. Biblical literature, as literature, even if you are from a different religion, a different belief, is valid and helpful because it allows imagination. It actually gives you a different imagination to look at the problem from a different way, to instead of looking at it as a problem,
Yeah,
to
and that's
imagine it.
that's
Yep. Yep.
yeah, and that's always sort of that pathway towards like the ask of faith. And I got to a point in the book where I needed to like say that like, hey, there does come a point where like this makes that ask. Um, here's the generative possibilities that come to us through
Mhm.
handling these stories in such a way and being on the receiving end of that. But to really follow those contours, to really learn that grammar is to be encountered, and to find that encounter of saying, well, where does this sort of life lead?
Right.
And I think that is a far more compelling
Hmm.
witness, and that's the witness the scriptures make. And
Agreed.
and but in our hands, particularly in the West, and I talk about this in the book, that one of the reasons that conspiracy theory maintains such a high and plausibility is because the way that the Bible has sort of been emptied of its wholeness. We've got our chapter verses, and so for the example of President Trump's assassination attempt, where you could find a dozen just chapter verses to sort of explain or authorize, why God may have had his hand, in a way that would demand Christian support him.
One of the most striking ideas that you mention uh, in your book, it's less argument and more story, myth-like stories that create an entire world,
Yeah.
right? And so these stories become powerful and they become more powerful than facts because they shape belief, as you mentioned. And so you even talk about the Left Behind series, which I remember when,
Yeah.
and I. I I think my question when I was reading that part of your book, it's how, and based on your example just now, how does this evangelical storytelling shape the frameworks that makes that conspiratorial thinking feel righteous?
Yeah, I mean, I would push even farther, like feel
Mm,
righteous, and that's a quality that
mm.
is rooted, I think, in the theological narratives that we tell, right?
Oof. Yeah.
And so like the qualities of these stories, conspiracy theories always tell a story that sort of has moral implications and moral power, right? There's the
Hmm.
right side and there's the wrong side. And so when those sorts of claims enter, from
Mm.
a variety of sources, culturally, socially, what have you, the anxieties of our present social order, when those find their way into evangelical churches, they are sort of transformed into theology, God talk,
Wow.
right? And so, like, yes, they feel righteous because they are
They
somewhat
have
of an extension.
authority.
Yeah, they're an
Right. Yeah.
extension of a communal story that's already being told about the world around us. And growing up in this, I experienced it every time Democrats were mentioned from the pulpit. Every time there was a referential point to Muslims, to pretty much any other.
Hmm.
I know it. The speed of American ministry makes it so that the church is really lacking on discernment,
Mm.
because not because we don't have, um, not because the Spirit isn't giving it,
Hmm.
but because we are moving so fast that
Mm.
the sort of life that discernment demands is off the table. And
That's
who's
so
taking
good.
off the table? Well, we're taking off the table
Yes.
because there's stuff that has to be done. So there's a sense in which, and I don't quite get into this in the book, though I do a little bit, is that a lot of this is also just because we're American. uh,
Industrialization, baby.
that
Efficiency.
we are people of the United States of America. I should even make that qualification. I say it all throughout the book. When I say American evangelicals, I'm talking about in the United States. Um, and so when you look at those righteous stories, it's not that it's not that they need to be proven. It's that they have plausibility in a story that in these communities already has authority, already has authenticity. And in some ways, these are stories that can't be fact checked. Um, and that's somewhat paradoxical because there's a huge strain in fundamentalism, in evangelicalism, that kind of says, hey, the proof of our faith is in apologetics and is in our ability to defend it and meet certain verifiable rational standards. Like, was Jesus real? Can we find evidence of this biblical city? And I'm not discrediting these disciplines. But I say in the book, if you and I were to get in a time machine and go back to a hill outside Jerusalem in AD 30 or 33 or somewhere in there,
Right.
would we and witness the crucifixion, it wouldn't automatically make us Christian. It wouldn't make anybody Christian. You're just seeing it, and to acknowledge that for most people, the prevailing story that gave interpretation to their world was that, oh, that man must have been a criminal. That man must have led a
And those
revolt against
and
Rome.
it's in scripture that to this day those stories are still making rounds. There's
Exactly.
still stories making rounds. Like, misinformation is not just misinformation. It's also, as you mentioned, identity, belonging. And my husband's from Saudi Arabia, so as I mentioned, when I was telling you, like, there this storytelling used, back in, years and years ago, it was a lot of what do they call that, folklore, like, where you speak the stories and memorize it, right? And so when you mention that, it makes so much sense that it's not about revealing truth in a fact. And at the end of the day, people are going to go by what they see, what they feel, what their culture tells them. And so when someone gives up a conspiracy belief, they're actually risking losing
Yeah.
a lot.
Yeah.
It's a cost. And I think you were touching on that earlier in our conversation. The cost that and I'm going to be bold about it. I think the cost that God is asking us at this time, specifically in America, it's too high for some. And it reminds me of the book Brothers Karamazov. The ask is too much. It's like it's change. You're going to have to deny everything.
In some ways, if we want to go with Dostoevsky, it is the Grand Inquisitor, right? It is the sense that we are doing a better job at this than you, and 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 it's the difficult ask of this, and this is where the story of Gideon, I think, comes,
Right.
is that Christianity can be idolatry. All I mean to say is that Jesus is not Christianity. So Jesus delivers us from that as well, and the cost. um, because evangelicals have put so much stock in this country in sustaining a particular sort of America, um, the dissolution of our common life devoted to that mission and that providing providing the morality that we feel like is necessary for God to continue to bless America, right? And when you start to examine it, that morality
Is compromised.
is not only compromised, right? But it's also well, yeah, it's compromised.
Right,
It's
right.
compromised. It also involves so many other points. Just my whole point of that is that our job, I don't think, is to construct or offer a Christian morality as much as it is to hear the command of God in our time and as creatures. And that is a whole different posture, receiving rather than possessing.
Mm.
And the more distance that we can put between the morality that society needs to function and what the Christian ethos would do in our time, those are two totally different things.
Agreed.
Because commitment to that morality to make society function would take us down this path of affirming and giving ourselves towards, for example, totally unrestrained capitalism and all of the ways that. So I am talking like real material
Right.
things at stake here that are
Right.
so much downriver from our story. So let me just kind of put this into a very, very relatable and accessible anecdote. Like I'm a hospice chaplain in my like day-to-day vocation. And I meet with a lot of caregivers who are watching their loved ones at end of life. They're caring for them, but they're also grieving. They're anticipating it. Well, I'm seeing more and more, and this isn't a surprise to anyone, is that, we Google everything. and and the information about, what happens at end of life, how can I tell decline is coming, all these sorts of things. I've described it recently as saying, at some point, you know, trying to grieve while garnering information from Google is basically like going to play paintball, but without a gun. And you're just kind of sitting out in the middle and just taking hits from everywhere. And there's these little just bits of information, right? And they're hitting everywhere. And we have no ability to make any sense of that. So it's overwhelming I mean, in a very material sense, overwhelming to our neurological pathways, our ability to receive and inputs like that. It's just overwhelming us. But all of us are telling a story, whether we realize it or not. These aren't things we think about on a normal daily basis. But that story, those stories, come out in our anxieties, the things that we fear to lose, the things that we feel passionate about. Like, and in the book, I'm essentially making this callback to say, we don't have a Christian worldview in the sense that it's some sort of static, bounded whole that we can just kind of point people to and say, no, that's what Christians ought to do. The church is a community that gathers each week to rehearse and remember this story. And there's always a repentance that comes in that liturgy. And to the extent that being evangelical in America has usually been boiled down to, did you pray a prayer this one time 30, 40 years ago, we've lost the ability to see how the daily act of worship, the daily gathering of worship, the weekly gathering of worship, is truly meant to be radically subversive in reminding us of the story. And here's the thing. Here's the challenge with all of this. Everything I just said, most evangelical pastors who look like me, right? White evangelical pastors, people who could be, if I put on a red hat, I could be MAGA passing, right? Like no one's asking anything about my politics. They'd agree with it.
Yep.
They would say, yeah, of course we believe all that. And so what's the issue? Well, I think to really press is to say that we have not preached in such a way that has sufficiently unsettled people for the barrage of propaganda and ways and other stories that come to us through those things. Absolutely. So, I as I'm writing this book a couple of years ago, I thought really heavily, like, I've thought about pastors, like reading this book, what's going to be the ask for them. And I felt the pressure of feeling like I needed to be a fact checker when I first began to encounter this stuff. And it was college students who were coming to me and saying, my parents are sharing the wildest things. I don't know how to do it. What am I supposed to do? And at first I put on my fact checker hat, and then I realized that wasn't working. And it wasn't working because the asks that were being made of my college students at the time were they were asks of faith. Like,
Right.
are you going to be a Christian?
Right.
That was a concern, that it was synonymous, that if they diverted from some sort of party line, that was taken as a as backsliding, to
Right.
use
Right.
my
That was the sin.
language.
That was
Right.
the sin. It's like, if you're not one of us, if you're not part of the club. And for me, it was always like, but I don't even know if the club even has space for me. I don't fit in. I have questions. I see serving as abusive because that's what was in my home. It was used to exude power over all of those points. Bring me to the bridge, right? Of when I first met you online, I was entering seminary to have the theological backbone to be able to make these claims that my heart and my soul has been making. So when when I read your book, I kept coming back to the conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. And what strikes me about that moment is that Jesus invites her into truth, but he does it through encounter, not domination. He asks questions, he reveals truth, he doesn't humiliate her. And one of the things that I found in commentary after commentary was it was always about her past, which at the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned that we cannot turn away from our past. We have to look at it, right? So I don't want to talk about any of the things that have harmed me because I've never felt safe to do so. But in that conversation where he reveals he's the Messiah, there is this in encounter. And all throughout your book, I just kept seeing that that's where it's pointing it to this encounter that feels so contrast to the way truth is argued about today,
Yeah.
right? This,
Yeah.
and so I am curious about your posture in this time of disreality. What might truthful encounter look like in a moment where so many people feel like defending their reality?
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about how my reality was ruined, and it a thousand different events, a thousand little pebbles in my shoe, right, that were disjointed and painful. But I remember one in particular where, a gentleman walked into our storefront church at the end of one of my sermons in New Orleans, and he was like, he was he was just himself. Like, he just walked in, he was on his phone, like, kind of broke every like rule of like, this is how not to enter a public space. And but I knew him,
Right.
and he walked in and he goes, "Hey, like, my sister-in-law is dying, like, right now. Like, I'm on the phone with my family in the hospital." And it was the invitation. So I didn't know what to, like, the script of like how a church service is supposed to go. That
Like,
it was
goes
like,
out the window.
and but here's the thing. You describe yourself as like, I'm someone who's asking questions. I'm not that person. You know what
Wow.
I mean? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I fully sort of absorbed the expectations, what it would mean to be um, just in this community, and so those scripts run really, really deep. And so in me, like, it wasn't like this, oh yeah, of course we got to do this. It was like, what do I do? Like, how am I going to explain this?
Right.
It was, I had two tracks running.
Right.
And so anyway, we bring him down in front. We just lay hands on him. We start praying, and his sister-in-law dies like while he's down there at the front. Now I'm thinking, now what do I say? And then I realized in that moment there was actually nothing to say. Like God had already spoken, and that's all I said is like, yeah, you don't need. You've seen. I don't need to add anything to this. And that was me learning that God's truth always authenticates itself.
Oof.
Always. The veracity of that truth, though, is not based strictly in material rationality by the
Mm.
standards of modernity, right? That
Wow.
it's the and Paul writes in one of his later letters, which I'm sure biblical studies people would say, well, maybe Paul didn't write that. Okay, I'm treating it as Christian scripture.
Yeah.
And in the book of Titus, he talks about good works that adorn the gospel. And I'm increasingly interested in the ways that the pursuit of justice, the aesthetics of beauty, and both of those bound up together. And I'm thinking of a book coming out by one who endorsed my book, Makoto, and his wife Heijin Fujimura,
Yes,
writing a book on this very topic about beauty and justice being linked together.
absolutely.
And I'm increasingly interested in the veracity of the Christian faith, the truthfulness of the Christian faith, as authenticated by something alongside or other than just mere rationality, than mere logical consistency. And and that's not to deny the the work, some total of saying, was Jesus a historical human being? I think we need to be able to have those sorts of conversations. But at the end of the day, the witness of the church across time has been to a story that the veracity and the authenticity of that story, what did Thomas say? Like, I'm not going to believe until I put my finger in his wounds. And Jesus says, like, blessed are those who will not see and will still believe, right? So Jesus himself anticipates, I think, the conversation that we're having right now
Absolutely.
is that the faith, the Christian faith, the faith of Jesus, is such a faith that entrusts our soul to the Father, and saying, like, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, right? Like, that's what the Christian
Amen.
faith is learning to do in real time. And
Right.
so in this posture, like right now of Disreality, um, I'm trying to gesture towards a posture that actually embraces the Christian story for the very particular sort of certainty and fulfillment that the Christian story offers, that the Christian faith offers. And at the same time, recognizing that participating in this story actually baptizes us into a great unknowing.
Mm, I love that.
Paradoxically so. And St. John of the Cross called faith a luminous darkness. And that is the title of a book coming out by James K.A. Smith that I'm thrilled to read here in a
Yeah.
couple weeks.
Yeah.
But that is essentially what my book is gesturing towards, as a positive. Like, how do we live in disreality? Well, we live by practicing what I call in the book good suspicion. And I have a battery of questions that I think are going to be incredibly practical for people as they walk through, like, how do you scroll through all information? And I want to do this in a way where, and I say this in the book, there are so many good people. Matthew Facchini is another, he's doing information science. There's so many different disciplines that
Hmm.
can teach us, like, to increase our media literacy and things like that. And I'm read enough on the literature to know that there's a train of thought out there that just kind of Christianizes and moralizes those attempts to just say, yep, these things are what Christians should do.
Right. Like a to-do list.
Yeah, and so I
Right.
don't want to discount, like, the offer of better media literacy and information quality and all the information science, all those sorts of things. But I am saying, what unique contribution does theology, does Christian faith make on its terms? And to that's where this language about story comes from. This language about you know disreality and about receiving reality from God. Those are the sorts of interventions that I think can make their way into liturgies, into preaching, into small groups in a way that is the most subversive, uncertain quality that will end up wrecking the totality
Hey,
that
amen.
AGA personifies. But here's the kicker, where I think that sort of subversion can happen while also providing safety in the midst of that subversion. And I think that's
Beauty.
what Jesus' encounter with
Yep.
the woman at the well is just is such, it's a quality of the word himself, right?
Yes.
That Jesus provides us the safety of repentance and the safety of acknowledging him,
Right.
which also then leads to the total dissolution and dispossession of everything we once took for granted and assumed as given. So if I could be really bold, it's enough to say and to claim that when we understand and confess, not possess, but when we confess that Jesus is reality and reality is Jesus as Christians, it means that we are totally dispossessed of our national citizenship. It
Wow.
means we are totally dispossessed of our possessions. And we're, to people asking, okay, that's the most idealistic thing I've ever heard, and I'm not going to pick this book up, and I'm not going to read this guy for, yeah, because he's just out there in total idealism. Let me put it this way. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was one of the major theological influences for the book, had this to say about the right of property. Right? He goes, in the church, the right to own property retains its validity but loses all of its seriousness.
Wow.
What a great
Wow.
way to just sidestep the whole, well, this is idealistic. Well, you know what? Now the onus is on me of saying, okay, I have a legal right to own these things, right? Okay. But the logic of legality is not determining my generosity and how I look at these possessions as a Christian. And so that is the sort of outcome, for example, of where I think this sort of subversive uncertainty leads us. Um,
Absolutely.
and so yeah, all of that is, I think, generative from the book,
Hmm.
but it's not necessarily explicitly in there. You're going to hear me talking about uncertainty and about subversion, what resistance looks like in truth telling, all kind of arising from like good suspicion. And at the heart of it, it's us growing in our willingness to say, I don't know. And where does that willingness come from? It comes from a faithful confidence that reality is God's and that truth will have its day, even if we can't narrate that as quickly. Truth is slow. Truth is weird. And I'm speaking in a
I'm going to
very
say
like,
truth is human
and
because that's who
exactly,
he is, right?
exactly.
That's how he came. Oh my gosh, Jared, this conversation healed something in me. And I'm going to just take a few minutes, like 2, 3 minutes to tell you. I got kicked out of my house for saying similar to what you said many years ago. And I didn't have the articulate language yet, right? I didn't
There
have,
was once in my life where I didn't have the, you know what I mean? Like this
right? We
was
don't,
born, this was costly.
right?
Yeah.
It was costly.
Yeah.
And I get choked up a little bit because it is costly. And when you said into the great unknowing, which I want to coin that so bad on my emails, I'm going to be like, into the great unknowing, Mariana.
Now I said it already. It's like, oh, okay.
Oh my gosh. But this conversation healed something in me because I felt this boldness that I don't want to leave this world with anything other than knowing that I did love my God with all my heart, soul, and mind. I learned, how to do that because you don't just know. And I loved my neighbor as myself. And that I'm still learning that, right? I'm still trying to learn that and unlearn so many biases, so many things that we pick up. And in that, remembering that, and you just succinctly put it, that we receive our reality from God. And if we as a people would live that out and bring this subversion in our beauty, in our art, in our creativity, in how we creatively think of ways to bring that to our neighbors, to each other, we would be so much better for it. And it would. I feel like it's kind of summed up in the prayer Jesus taught his disciples, which is, as in heaven, on earth, right? And so I just want to thank you so much. I have a little question that I ask all my
Sure.
podcast
Yeah.
guests, and it's, what book do you return to again and again, or you would want to reread for the first time? It could be any genre, it could be anything, but I would love to know what's a book that you just can't stop thinking about.
I would probably say if I could read a book over again for the first time, probably The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene. And I had a friend, his name is Nathan. So if Nathan's listening to this, a long time ago when I was a pastor, he's like, "You don't read enough fiction." And I was like, "Oh, what are you talking about? Like, I'm fine." I just read I really did almost exclusively nonfiction.
Yeah.
So I'm laughing here because like Nate's found his way into my brain, because I'm here saying like this. There's a truth that only fiction can convey,
Right.
and that's precisely what The Power and the Glory was for me. It's a story about they called him a whiskey priest in Mexico when there was persecution of Catholics, and just a novel from Graham Greene. So yeah, that would be one.
Very cool. Very cool. Jared, thank you for this conversation, for the work that you're doing in and through Reality in Ruins. Your book reminds us that rebuilding a shared world isn't simply about correcting facts. It's about recovering a way of life rooted in humility, honesty, and courage. Because conspiracy thinking promises secret knowledge, as we mentioned, that separates insiders from outsiders. but the gospel shows a different path, truth revealed through encounter. So thank you for this encounter. For our listeners, Reality in Ruins releases March 17th, and we will link the book in the show notes and on social media. If today's conversation helped you think, question, or see more clearly, will you share this episode with whoever you feel might need it? And as always, you're welcome here. Until next time, we'll meet you at the well.